Open up your Bible. We're going to be in chapter 5 tonight. We'll cover chapter 5 and go through 5 and look out some of these. Now, let's again, as we look again at the historical context of when Hosea is written, we're looking at a time of the dividing between the northern and southern kingdom was around 900 BC, and we're sitting at around 750 BC. All these dates are always soft dates. When the kingdom was divided, it was because of the sin of Solomon. And when it was divided, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, in his behavior, caused the rift and division between the northern tribes, 10 tribes, and the southern tribe of Judah and Benjamin stay together pretty much. And in that, then, of course, Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, sets up false religion. And this is where it really continues. And when we consider 901 or about 900 BC, all the way up to 750, God has put up with this false religion that's been going on in the northern kingdom. And in that, God's patience and sending his prophets have constantly tried to exhort them to changing their way and to come back and repent to him, but has failed to do so. They've continued to just grow worse and worse. Taking in the false gods from all the nations around them. On top of that, he built a golden calf in Dan and one in Bethel, and established them as places of worship in order so the people would not have to travel as a rouge. And that's going to come up tonight as we look at this afternoon anyway, is this idea of false religion being established in order to try to make it look like an expedience and that you don't have to travel all the way to the temple. But it really was a way of keeping people from becoming loyal back to Judah. And in that, he had to come up with different ways to block them. And that was always kind of a problem. It didn't work. Most of the faithful fled. They left the 10 northern tribes and went south. And so I'm going to read 4, just go through it real quick, because chapter 4 really helps to bring the heart of the message and the problem. I'm just going to read it and look at that. So chapter 4. Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murdering, stealing, and committing adultery. They break all bonds, and bloodshed flows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in the land, in it languish. And also the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. Yet let no one contend, and let no one accuse, for with you is my contention, O priests. You shall stumble by day, the prophets shall stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being priests to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. The more they increase, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory to shame. They feed on the sin of my people. They are greedy for their iniquity. It shall be like the people, like priests. I will punish them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. They shall eat, but not be satisfied. They shall play the whore, but not multiply, because they have forsaken the Lord, to cherish whoredom wine, new wine, which take away understanding. My people inquire of a piece of wood, and their walking staff give them oracles. For a spirit of whoredom has led them away, and they have left their God to play the whore. They sacrifice on the tops of the mountains, and they burn offerings on the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is good. Therefore your daughters play the whore, and your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go aside with prostitutes and sacrifice with cult prostitutes, and the people without understanding shall come to ruin. Therefore you play the whore, O Israel. Let not Judah become guilty. Enter into Gilgal, nor go up to Beth-aven, and swear not, as the Lord lives. Like a stubborn heifer, Israel is stubborn. Can the Lord now feed them like a lamb in a broad pasture? Ephraim is joined to idols. Leave him alone. When their drink is gone, they give themselves to whoredom. They rule. Their rulers dearly love shame. A wind has wrapped them in its wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. Right away, he talks about the leadership and this idea that the leadership are the primary people that are responsible. But he does not let the people off themselves. They're still responsible for that. And that's why when we looked at the history of some of the people leaving and migrating and leaving Israel, those were the priests that remained faithful to God and to the Mosaic covenant. But the ones who stayed back were still going to be held accountable because they had the ability to know. Sometimes we can blame the leaders, but ultimately as well, individuals are going to be held accountable and the consequences are going to come upon all of them. But he does focus on them. One thing that I found in looking at idols and idol worship, and it's important to look at the evilness of idol worship, because it is something that is fascinating as I started to look and study about idols and these gods. And if you were to go back, you could, there's parallels to every one of these gods in all the cultures. And it goes all the way back to right after Babel. When you come out of Babel, you start to see Gilgamesh, you start to see the Egyptians, you see the same gods that you can see that are the same gods that then come from Mesopotamia, influence the same gods that are being worshiped in Egypt, that the Canaanites are worshiping. And then later you see even the Greeks have gods that are parallel in the same way. And at first, I used to think about how, well, this is just kind of a nature. You look at the water, well, it gives life. And so you worship water gods and things like this. But they have this really terrible aspect to them. And that's the sacrifice of life. In order to produce life, they think that you have to give life. You have to sacrifice life. And it was a perversion, really, of the sacrifice that God had established for atonement of sin by teaching people that their sins and the sacrifice of animals. But this perversion really is this evilness that has permeated across and perverted the original concept of sacrifice, and then comes across into these fake idols and gods. And God calls them little g gods, but in a sense, they have this fake power that we have already seen that Hosea has been showing that has a tremendous influence. We look at them and we think somehow that they're ignorant people. How could you look at a piece of wood and give it glory and stuff? No, there's a strong, strong influence that has come upon the people that I truly believe is this deception that Satan has put on the people because of their hearts, and they have really believing in this. The problem is all of these false gods, every one of them, if you go from the Greeks to the Mesopotamians to the Egyptians, and you can go all the way around the world, by the way, if we had time, and you'll find it all the way in Central America. The same type of gods, little g gods, that people started worshiping. And I don't think it's an accident. I think that this is a part of this big scheme of Satan to distract people away. You have human sacrifices on this continent that were thousands and thousands of miles away. You have the same type of gods. The Indians worship, the Asians worship, and that's why when we look at this, we should not think about, they just had this false doctrine. It's far more evil than that. And the perversion of it is what is so devilish and deceptive, is how it was able to merge it off of that sacrifice that God said was for atonement in a proper method, was just animals. But it became human sacrifices as well. And you look at God's people. These are God's people. And how that it could influence them. And we sit back and just are shocked and appalled and go, how could they do that? Well, look around in our country and look at all the different ways people have taken one word and turned it into all different interpretations. And it's similar to that initial sacrifice of God's way of showing atonement in the Mosaic law, and the perversion, and then calling all those other perversions God, power. And we have the same thing that's happening to God's word that's taken, and God's people themselves, they got the same word, are taking it and perverting it into multiple ways of saying these are God. And they're not. What they become is idols within themselves. All these perversions of doctrines are becoming little gods and giving power to those doctrines and those false teachings. And they're just as corrupt in what they do. To think that they would sit and worship a piece of wood. Well, it sounds, when you read Hosea, somehow it's just a piece of wood and stuff. But all of this goes back to Molech. And Molech was one of the main gods that was a demanding of human life. And we see that even Ahaz and Manasseh, kings of Judah, the one tribe that we thought was kind of holding fast, and he's going to mention them in chapter 5, that they were holding fast and doing kind of good, and then all of a sudden Ahaz starts offering his sons. Manasseh offers his children. They're in Jerusalem. We talked about it, the valley of Gehenna. How could you go that far? And so this is why I'm bringing this up, is because 4 and 5 really do come together, and they have to be kind of taken together as well. So now when he comes to 5, the first 2 verses, he comes again to those primarily accountable, those who should have been paying attention, and they're going to be held accountable. He says, "Hear this, O priests. Pay attention, O house of Israel. Give ear, O house of the king, for the judgment is for you. For you have been a snare at Mizpah and a net spread upon Tabor. And the revolters have gone deep into slaughter, and I will discipline all of them." So he starts out, house of Israel. And this is where we talked about earlier, some of these names I want you to kind of hopefully start to learn as you hear them. Ephraim, and then that is one of the most richest and most influential tribe of all the 10 in the northern kingdom. They also, when they were united, had a very strong influence on the nation when they were one together. They were a very prosperous nation. So you'll hear them singled out and brought out on their own. But then Hosea will go back and then mention Israel. So when he goes Ephraim and Israel, he's talking about the leadership that the tribe of Ephraim was using, but then he brings in the other tribes, but not by naming them individually, but as Israel. And then you heard Judah. Judah is in a shadow here. Judah is right on the verge of being down the same equality of judgment, but they're just a little bit further down. They have not progressed. And so that's why the prophets are bringing this up. It's almost like, hey, Judah, listen up. This is what's happening here to the 10 northern tribes. You're just one step behind them. And you would think that would wake them up. And especially once you start to see what Hosea, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all of them are prophesying happen, you would really have thought Judah would have snapped. They didn't. And it's this stubbornness that we're going to see as well, an attitude that he talks about here in chapter 5. So when he talks about this judgment is specifically for them, he's now focusing on the leadership. You have been a snare at Mizpah and a net spread upon Tabor. That has been a difficult phrase for scholars to nail when you start to look at different commentaries and stuff. What exactly are they talking about? He's talking specifically about the leaders, and then, of course, the priests. The priests were responsible for, conducting the ceremonial things in which would serve God in the temple and the sacrifices and teaching them. But the king was the law enforcer. And so between the two, there should have been a balance. Whenever the priesthood was out of whack, the king should have stepped up and said, wait a minute, because they were supposed to keep the law with them and have it and know it. Whenever the opposite would happen, whenever the king was out of whack, the priest should have stepped up and said, wait a minute, king, you're out of whack. There's something wrong here. You need to fix this. You can't be doing this. And so he starts with them. But this idea of Mizpah and then Tabor, 2 geographic locations, there's been some discussion among scholars when you study this aspect in this verse right here, as far as being a snare and a net, and this idea as well as the revolters going deep into slaughter. And the idea, the revolter is basically those who have gone into apostate, those who have rebelled. That's what, if you look into the Hebrew and kind of dig into that, is what he's talking about. And who are they? Well, those are the leaders themselves. So, but there's something happening when he talks about using these geographic locations, and the idea as possible that this slaughter is not sacrificial type of slaughtering, but also possibly a symbolic way of showing them blocking from proper religion of them people that were wanting to travel south to Judah. And if you looked at a map, you could kind of see it's possible that the kings and people were saying, we're shutting our borders down. We're not going to let you travel. And that they laid like a snare. And whether it was a figurative one or, a literal one, but they were basically holding back and snaring people. And it was causing more and more and more into the depths of this ungodly worship and such. And so the condition that they had. But he says, bottom line, they're all going to be disciplined. All of them will be disciplined for this. This is where he's going to use two terms, the name Ephraim in verse 3 and 4. He says, I know Ephraim, and Israel is not hidden from me. For now, O Ephraim, you have played the whore. Israel is defiled. Their deeds do not permit them to return to their God, for the spirit of whoredom is within them, and they know not the Lord. So Ephraim, the main influence coming from them that they had on them. But he says, I know. And what he means is, you can't hide. I know your heart. I know what you're doing. So I'm aware of it. And Israel, you're not hiding either. You can't point to Ephraim and say, oh, well, they're the ones that caused this. No, you are as well are a part of this. And this idea of the whore, again, is looking at this idea of the treachery through adultery, the infidelity of the relationship that they should have had with God. Now, they've had it since 900 BC because they stopped worshiping God properly. It's gone even further. God's grace and love and long-suffering has extended from 901 to 750. So hundreds of years plus that God has waited and showing them. So this is not something that's sudden. It's just gotten to the point where God's long-suffering is done. And he says now, because of their actions, they have hardened their behavior, their culture, that now it's really impossible for them to be able to repent. And this is what I've always said, and I keep going back to the historical event that we're aware of Sodom and Gomorrah, that Sodom and Gomorrah reached a point where God said, that's it. There's no more opportunity for them. And so when we look, and I talked about from 901 to 720, when they're finally taken off, and then another 100 years, we see that then Judah goes away, is that the long suffering of God waiting for the righteous to have an influence to help change the nation. And what we're hearing right here in these verses is God saying, it's gone. It's gone. They can't even turn if they wanted to. It's been so many generations. And he's going to talk about their children, the generations that have come. He said, the Spirit. In other words, it is so much in them that that's who they are. They are treacherous. They have accepted it so ingrained in them that they don't even know God. They have lost the total knowledge of God. They're totally deluded. But see how he talks about Israel and Ephraim, this idea both are accountable. But that's a relationship. It's interesting. I mean, if you think about it, he could have just stayed with using the word Israel. You and I today wouldn't have known the difference, and I wouldn't have sat here and pointed this out, but it is something I thought was interesting that he really highlights the influence that Ephraim has had. He's calling them out by name, whereas all the other tribes, he lumps them under Israel. They're all really Israel, but man, he calls Ephraim out. It's like you. It's like somebody saying all of you are going to be punished, but you, one by name. It's you and everybody else. And when you get called out, so it really kind of shows you their role and the depth in which they're involved in this defilement. So he continues in 5, basically kind of saying the same thing. The pride of Israel testifies to his face. Israel and Ephraim shall stumble in his guilt. Judah also will stumble with them. With their flocks, their herds, they shall go to seek the Lord. But they will not find him. He has withdrawn from them. They have dealt faithlessly with the Lord, for they have all borne alien children. Now their new moon shall devour them with their fields. So the pride, I thought about a lot of people that I've run across in my life, and historical people, famous people, just some people that I've known in my life. And it is interesting how that one's pride, somebody who has pride, says a lot about them. It almost radiates the very flaw in which they try to cover. It's a falseness that they project. And in their pride, we know what? The proverb writer says, what comes after the pride? A fall. But, here, he is saying the pride is testifying to their own face. In other words, it's there, but they don't even see it again. It's this total inability to not only know God and be able to turn to God, but their own pride as well is in their face, in their presence. And so then you notice he's again still kind of keeping Israel and Ephraim identified, but they're both going to stumble. And they're going to stumble in their guilt. And I thought it also interesting is because you could say a person can stumble by a lot of means. So, well, you stumble by being faithless. You could stumble by not obeying, by being a sinner, right? You stumble when you sin. I thought it was interesting. He says you're stumbling by your guilt. Guilt is an emotion you have after you've been found out. If these people are in this heart of condition, like he mentioned in the previous verses, they have no guilt for what they're doing. They have no guilt. They don't even know God. It's like, you have to have guilt after you've acknowledged that I've done something wrong, and then you feel guilty. So what this is going to be is when they stumble, it's kind of like you're walking along. Have you ever walked along and then just tripped? And then you went, oh, and after you stumbled, then you realize what you just did? This is what's going to happen to them. They're going to be living their lives with pride, with ignorance of God, and then when this hits them, this judgment comes upon them, and then that stumble, and the Assyrians attack, and the Syrians attack, then they're going to realize what they have done to God, and that guilt is going to be a part of that. It's going to be the awareness in that stumbling. They're going to see that guilt that's going to come upon them. He says Judah's going to happen too. So you notice now he's reaching up, he's bringing in Judah, because like I said, they're just a couple of steps from the same path. They're right behind them when it comes to this. Now their flocks and their herds, in other words, they're going to try to go and appease God after it comes upon them, and it's going to be too late. It's not going to happen. Now, this is also really pointing out the phase of judgment that's going to hit them that they don't quite understand. This is a part of the prophet that later on, once the judgment has been fulfilled, that they're going to look back, especially Judah, when they're in captivity and they're reading this and looking back and going, oh, that's when the Assyrians first came in and they took off 2 of the tribes, and this type of idea where this awareness was starting to come on him. It was sudden. Remember this. Israel is living in a time of prosperity. They are living it up. They've never had it better. The dollar is strong. The economy's great. The unemployment's low. There's really no threat on sight. There's these rascals, the Assyrians, that are sitting up there by, where Nineveh is, on northern Iraq, kind of Turkey region. Then you got these Syrians that are sitting on what we would actually call Syria today, just kind of to the north of them, and they're rascals too. They're not really good people, but yeah, they're not a threat to them yet. And then you got the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, that are way down there toward what we modern would call Kuwait. And don't forget about the Persians that are sitting up toward Iran. All of these are cultures and nations that are going to be rising up in the future that God is going to use to bring forth justice over the next couple hundred years. So they don't see this phase that's going to occur, but he's going to continue as we go through this and point it out, because things are going to go bad. Right now, they're sitting nice and secure. But that little country, Syria, that's just to the north of Israel, they're going to start getting feisty. They're going to start bringing problems on both Judah and Israel. And if you were to go over to the king, we could sit and look at that and study it. But it's kind of this phase that he's kind of bringing through the prophets. He's kind of opening up this idea of how this is going to start to happen, that, even when you go try to seek, you're not going to find him. Why? Because God's withdrawn fellowship. God has pulled away from them because they have played the harlot. They have been adulterous. They've been unfaithful to him. And in that unfaithfulness, in that relationship that they've had with those false gods, what have they produced in their children? Remember, he starts out, Hosea had married a wife who was unfaithful. He had unfaithful children, and they're children of a generation that were faithless. And this is where he's coming again and kind of showing the idea of these generations that have come on. Now remember, 901, they separated and started the golden calf stuff, north and south. So how many generations have already come and gone and been living under this culture? And now you have 5, 6 generations that have grown up, and this is all they've known. And all they've done is produce illegitimate children. And I mean in the sense of the fact that they're illegitimate spiritually. And that's all they are. And so that's why he says this idea that, their children are a part of this unfaithfulness. And so he says, for they have born alien. That's that alien children he's talking about. When he says about the new moon shall devour them with their fields, I heard a couple of things. Now, some translations just say moon. Most of the scholars believe it's more of new moon. And you say, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference was in the calendar when it came to the way that they did business. That at the new moon, it's kind of like the first of the month, you got your check. And what else did you get? You got your bills. Your bills came in on the new moon. You had to pay your bills on the new moon. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like, guess what, guys? When the new moon comes, when your bills come due, the debt comes due, that's what's going to happen. And what's going to happen is your profits, what you have, will be consumed. So we don't pay our bills on new moons. We have an actual calendar. But that's kind of the idea that I thought was really amazing. But their profits were their fields. And so the debt's coming due, guys. That's what he's saying. So now he says, warns them, blow the horn in Gibeah, the trumpet in Ramah, sound the alarm at Bethaven. We will follow you, O Benjamin. Ephraim shall become desolation in the day of punishment. Among the tribes of Israel I will make known what is sure. The princes of Judah have become like those who have moved the landmark. Upon them I will pour out my wrath like water. Ephraim is oppressed, crushed in judgment, because he was determined to go after filth. But I am like a moth to Ephraim and like dry rot to the house of Judah. This is a great pronouncement of the arrival of the enemy coming. This is a part of the first phase when we see that this comet, this type of a fast cornet, horn, was blown for warning and announcing that it was going to come and come after this threat that was approaching to them. This idea is when Syria rose up and started to become a threat, you find that Israel, the northern king, tried to find help. Of course, he didn't try with God. He tried to get the Assyrians, who were further north of Syria. So he took and went to the king of Assyria and tried to make peace and get him to help them out. That's going to backfire. Judah does the same thing. They're going to try, because when the first invasion comes in, both of them are threatened. 4 of the tribes are taken off on that first phase, and Judah is threatened as well. And so there's this sequence of historical things that start to line up with this idea here. And again, I want to point out Bethaven went from Bethel, house of God, to basically house of waste. He's renaming that location there. And so Ephraim will become a place of desolation when this comes upon them, and he's going to make sure everybody knows about it. And then he talks in 10 about the princes of Judah have become like those who have moved the landmark. This is moving the boundaries. This is what we would say that somebody has loosened up their interpretation of the law. You have a boundary, or maybe this isn't quite appropriate, where you say, well, there's a red line this is the line in the sand. Step across it. And you keep moving it. Say, okay, well, this is the line. Don't step across this line. This is the boundary here. What they're talking about is that he's basically loosened up the boundaries of God's law and enforcing, and has taken upon himself to start to endorse actually some of the very idol worship, and Judah started to do this. What was fascinating is King Assur actually goes to Damascus in Syria, and when he's there, and it's recorded in 2 Kings, he sees the temple of the king of Damascus, and he's like, wow, this is a really great idol. This is a great worship. And he sends the pattern down to have the priest in Jerusalem to make this. And this is really what the scholars say that they're talking about totally removing the boundaries and starting to adopt some of the foreign gods and getting worse. So they're a step behind in judgment, but man, they're moving fast. And as Israel's judgment's being inflicted, Judah's king becomes more abomination, and he then starts trying to seek alliance to survive himself. And in doing so, he makes it worse and speeds up his own judgment on Judah as well. And so you're not going to stop this. The crush, the judgment will come. And I like the way he changes this. He says, because Ephraim has come after, he says, gone after filth. Filth. When he says, like a moth to Ephraim, what does a moth do? A moth slowly consumes, starts to eat away. But then he brings in Judah. Judah has this rottenness that's starting to come. And this is going to all happen because of these historical phase of judgment that's going to be coming upon them. When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to the great king. But he is not able to cure or heal your wound. For I will be like a lion to Ephraim and a young lion to the house of Judah. I, even I, will tear and go away. I will carry off, and no one shall rescue. So this is, again, we see historically in 2 Kings, it's 15:19, where the first king of the Judah that did of Israel that did this was Menahem. And he applied to the king Pul to try to get help and relief, and it didn't work. And then there's a second time, the next king, Hosea, who also tries, and that's Shalmaneser in 2 Kings 17. So this is what Hosea is prophesying, saying what's going to happen is that they're actually going to dig it worse and worse. The idea of the different levels, but both you see this judgment is coming on both houses eventually. And they're basically not going to be able to stop this. You can go out and you can try to bring in all the allies you want, and it's not going to work. And he says, I will return again to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face, and in their distress earnestly seek me. In other words, I'm going to step back when it's done. When this judgment occurs, I'm going to step back and wait. And when they finally acknowledge their guilt and seek my face, and remember, they're in their stumbling, it's going to be because of their guilt. It's going to trigger. So this is the last phase of this part of the judgment. He's prophesying and saying that when they finally seek him in this distress, sadly, that's what it's going to take. So that's chapter 5. So we'll pick up in chapter 6 next week. If you're with us this evening and there's something we can do to help you in your relationship with God, I hope that you will take this moment. We're going to be singing the invitation song to seriously take a moment to think about your relationship with him. And if we can help you by praying and encouraging you or any other need you may have, let us know while we stand and sing the invitation song.